Welcome everyone to the API governance stage here at API Days. My name is Mark Boyd. I use the pronouns he and him. I'm the director of Platformable, and I'm glad to be your host for the entire day of discussion on API governance, business models, streaming and event architecture. So here's where it's at. So looking forward to some great talks today. Just a quick reminder that there is a chat section on the stage, so please make sure to use that to share some questions. I'm keeping an eye on it so that we can ask our speakers questions after their presentations. And speaking of speakers, we've got Matthias from Software AG up first, talking about one of my favorite subjects, digital business models.
Matthias. Yeah, hi. My name is Matthias, and I often talk to customers about API monetization and about API business value. And in those discussions, well, the topic of how do I monetize my API comes up very often, right? So the question is usually when we talk business value or business models of APIs, the first question typically is, how do I make money with my API? Or they say, hey, I just implemented my API. The only thing I just need to do is I need to monetize this. How do I need to do it? Or, well, the fear of missing out. Our APIs are free, some people say, and do we leave money on the table when we don't monetize our APIs? So, but what we actually know about API monetization is that only the smallest part of APIs are directly monetized, in the sense that if you want to have access for the API, you need to pay money for accessing this API. So business value for API has to be looked at much broader than just the exchange of API access for money, right? API access for money, that means direct API monetization. And that's only the smallest part of all the APIs. The largest part of APIs that have a very important business value is indirectly monetized. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Indirect monetization is a very abstract term, right? And it can be just a question of currency, right? So in direct API monetization, it means exchanging API access for money. And in indirect API monetization, maybe that exchange is a little bit more complicated, right? It's indirect, so maybe around 3 corners. And what do I exchange the access for the API to then instead? And I can have different currencies. So for example, I can exchange the API access for data or for additional features that other people are building for my product. Or it could be that I get access to customers in exchange for access to the API. Right? And these different currencies that are not money, they have different properties, which can be actually quite interesting. So I'm just going to give you a couple of properties. You can look at the properties of money and of other things like data, but just two very interesting properties that make the point that those currencies are actually very different. So what we know about money is that, well, in order for you to have money, I have to give my money away, right? So I can only eat the cake or I can have the cake. But with data, it's different. With data, I can make copies of the data, and that allows me to eat the cake and you to have the cake, right? So in that respect, the data currency is more powerful. It's also interesting to look at what it's interesting to look at how the value grows when I add another unit of this currency. For example, when I add another unit of money, then the value grows linearly. But with data, that's differently. With data, I have more than linear growth. I have externalities, and that means when I add another piece of data, another unit of data, that could be the missing puzzle piece to make the value of the data that I already have much more valuable as a result. Okay, so it makes sense to not only think about API monetization in terms of getting money, because as you can see, the money currency has its limitations. And for example, data has some really interesting properties. So to look at this topic more broadly, I look at API as a mechanism for exchanging value. And this mechanism for exchanging value is actually very, very old. For example, here you have barter. Barter is actually a term that's used for exchanging goods or services for other goods or services without using money, right? And here's a picture from 1555 where some traders are exchanging different goods directly without using money. Maybe they don't have money, or there's other limitations that prevent them from using money. Now, to make the point more clearly, let's look at an example. So you have a farmer, and this farmer has a lot of ham, right? More than he can eat, and he would like to eat a fish. And you have a fisherman who has a lot of fish, more than he can eat, and who would like to eat ham. So they come together and they just exchange their goods, right? So the farmer is here, the fisherman is here, and what they do is they just exchange it. Right? And how do they know that this is a good exchange? Well, somehow they introduce a way of measuring the value of these goods, and they come together and then decide if they want to take part in this transaction. Right? And their way of measuring could be, for example, a scale where they just look at the weight, and if it's the same weight, then it's okay. But it could be also something else. Now let's take that picture with the exchange, and now we have digital transformation. And with digital transformation, our farmer and our fisherman now become an API consumer and an API provider. Right? So they too, just as before, do an exchange with the API. Now, before it was ham and fish, now we have a request and a response that are exchanged. And the request has some data, and the response also contains some data. So what they're doing actually is they're bartering on the data that they exchange. Right? So a request is sent over to the API provider, and the API provider does something, some computation, some lookup, and sends back the response. Okay. Now, this is actually exactly the same as we've seen previously with the farmer and the fisherman. So we just took that concept that we knew from farmer and fisherman and transferred it to API consumer and API provider. And the structure of the API, this transactional structure, request and response, lends itself to this barter transaction on data. And when we look at data, what do we actually mean by the data that is exchanged, the request data and the response data? Well, that can be the payload data primarily, but there's also metadata like the HTTP headers, or there's references, for example, references to the API consumer, their identity, or references to the identity of the end user in this data, which is also valuable in some sense. Now, as we did before, we can now put this data on a scale and can say, well, what's the value of this data? And sometimes the API provider brings more value in this barter exchange, and then it looks like this. Then our scale goes down on the side of the response where the API provider has more value. And this is the typical case. So we need to somehow get that scale and balance again for everyone to think this is a good transaction and wanting to participate in that transaction. So typically the API consumer who gets the better end of the deal needs to put in some money or some additional value on his side, because the request is just not as valuable in comparison to the response. But you also have the other case where the API consumer brings more value. It's not the typical case, but you find those cases. And here, the request weighs actually much more, is more valuable than the response. And the API provider needs to be the one who is putting in money in on his side, right, to make his response more valuable and make this an interesting transaction for everyone wanting to participate. So the question is, how does this scale actually work? Because maybe you ask yourself, you've worked with APIs, but you've never seen the scale, right? This weighing machine. And well, this weighing machine is actually just here for us to think about, but the burden to design the rules of the transaction is actually always with the API provider. The API provider, as a package, offers the request response, kind of the technical design of the API, plus the economic design of the API, meaning the rules for what needs to be paid and how the different inputs and outputs are valued. The API consumer is, in difference to a normal barter exchange, out of the picture because he just needs to have a binary decision. Do I want to participate in this transaction or not? In a real barter exchange, they can haggle with each other and they can say, well, give me a little bit more of this and more of that. So the API provider really has the burden to design that system and make it fair to get a maximum amount of transactions, right? And this is actually API design. And this API design contains not only the design of the technical transaction, but also the design of the economic transaction, right? So both aspects need to be looked at by the API provider. And well, the technical transaction is what we're really strong at. Design of the technical transaction. For example, we have the Open API specification that really describes the technical aspects of this transaction. And that's what we're super strong at. I mean, we're still working on it, but we have really good understanding of what this technical transaction is and how do we want to design it. Now, where we have much more work to do as a community and as an industry is actually the economic transaction, making the API profitable and finding ways of thinking about the design of this economic transaction. Good. So one way to think about this design of the economic transaction is to look at the design space. And the design space in terms of, on X and Y axis, both the technical API design and the economic API design. Now, if you want to do a design, then the economic API design should not be an afterthought. I often see this, but it should not actually be the case. What you see often happening is that you take a lot of technical design decisions, one after the other, until your design is kind of closed. And then in the end, you come up with the question and say, hey, technical design is finished, it's implemented. How do I monetize this? And the options in this design space are then very limited. Maybe you don't find a good way to monetize this API because you have already come so far in narrowing down and constraining your API design. So what could be the alternative? The alternative could be that you have a co-design between technical and economic aspects of the API. So you start out with maybe an economic API design decision. For example, what data do I want to get from the API consumer? And then you go over to making some technical, some economic, some technical and technical API design decision. So in that way, you don't limit yourself too late in the design space and have no option anymore to explore economic aspects of API design. Okay. Some tools for doing this. The economic aspects. I mean, I've talked about the technical aspects before, where you have things like API specifications, open API specs, but what tools do we have for the economic aspects of API design? Well, I'm going to show you 4 here. It's probably not all of them that are out there, but you can look, for example, at the API value chain. You can look at the value proposition of the API. For example, the value proposition canvas can be such a tool. You identify the target customers, you identify what value this API brings to the target customers. Another tool is the business model canvas. where you can look at the business model of the API provider. That's primarily, of course, what you look at, but you also need to look at the business model of the API consumer. And the API typically connects those two business models, the business model of the API provider and the business model of the API consumer. And then another aspect is, and that we will look at in detail later on, is the relation between the API and the product, which is very important to look at. And I think we will directly jump there. The role of an API in relation to the product. Okay. So you can think of your enterprise, your organization, shipping products already. Then comes digital transformation, and now you have APIs. What's the relation between this API and the product that you're already shipping, right? So that's kind of the question, and there are several patterns here, right? So we're looking at the role of the API in relation to the bigger product. And let's look at all these different patterns that we find here. Actually, I'm just going to show you 4 different patterns today. There are more, but maybe those already give you some idea of what you could be looking for in terms of API monetization. So the first one is that the API is actually the product. There's no difference between product and API. The API is the product. Next one is the API is a feature of this bigger product that we're already shipping to customers. Next one is the API is a funnel for sales or marketing to get leads in. And the next one is that the API is a spoon. It feeds data into our product. And what do I mean with all of these? We go through them one by one. And keep in mind, these are not the only patterns that there are. These are just 4 that I thought are interesting to show. So first one is API is the product. And we are all familiar with those, right? So Stripe or Twilio, where those businesses are the API providers. They have data and capability. They bring out the API as a product to the API consumer, and value flows from the API provider to the API consumer, and money in this sense, now it's really money flows from the API consumer to the API provider. What's out of the picture is the end user product and the end user. And it's a lot like the supplier model that we have, for example, in the automotive industry, right? Where you have a certain part of the API consumer's product being built by this API as a product company. And typically those are directly monetized. Those things are directly monetized. So we have a scale that tips towards the API provider and needs to be put into perspective, or needs to be put into equilibrium by putting some money on the API consumer side. Okay. Next pattern I want to show you, and this is maybe a bit more interesting, is API as a feature. So you have a product, and this product has a lot of features. For example, you have Spotify, and Spotify has features like listen to music on the mobile phone, listen to music in the web browser. Those are all features of the overall product. And now you add an API. Okay, so the API is a feature. But the interesting thing about making the API a feature is that the API is a feature multiplier. So it means that it creates the opportunity for people outside the business, outside of Spotify in this case, to create features of the product. For example, an automotive company could come and say, hey, we're going to put a player into our car so you can listen to Spotify in the car. And these are features of the Spotify product, so to say, which are not directly created by the product company itself. And what you do here when API is a feature is that you actually build really strong ecosystems around your product. So here you have a customer, and this customer in his digital environment has a couple of apps that he's using, a couple of products that he's using. And when those products are then linked with each other, for example, they exchange data via APIs, then this ecosystem gets a lot stronger, and the products themselves get a lot stronger, and the customers really like those products much more because now they are interconnected with each other, and the value of each of these products increases by using it in combination with all the other products in the ecosystem. So from a monetization perspective, when, as you see here, those three companies are producing APIs as a feature, is actually that there is no need for direct monetization, because already it's kind of an equilibrium between what goes in and what goes out, what the API consumer gets and what the API provider gets. You increase the product utility for the mutual end users and customers on both sides, and you build an ecosystem. You can even sync your customer base. We're good. So we're coming up to the next pattern, and the next pattern is when the API is a funnel that brings leads into the sales process for our product. So you can think of, for example, an insurance company which has an API to create an insurance, and you have maybe a comparison site, or you have a travel booking site which requires an insurance, and that sends the leads over to the insurance company via an API. Here, this is actually an example where you have a lot more value on the API provider side. So the API provider gets most of the value because he gets leads for his product, and the API consumer gives his leads. So the API provider has to compensate for that by actually paying the API consumer. And now I'm coming to the final pattern that I want to show you, and that is when the API feeds data into the product. And when the API feeds data into the product, then typically you also have an equilibrium. It's also typically an ecosystem use case where both sides kind of profit from it. So the API consumer feeds data in, profiting the API provider, and the API provider gives access to customers for the API consumer, which typically creates a very interesting environment for the API consumer to create digital products in. Yes. So I think at this point I want to end, and thank you for listening. Keep in mind, the next time you think about API monetization, that, well, there are those 4 patterns that you can use. So it's not all about monetization. You have a lot of different options. You have the option to change the currency. You have the option to apply those patterns. And it's not always about getting money and getting directly paid for your API.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Matthias. What I really loved is that for architects and API designers, it really helps them accentuate the story of the value of the business model beyond just monetization. When they're talking across a business, the business is, okay, how do we price the API? And I think by understanding these 4 design patterns, you give the architects and the designers a new toolkit for being able to express why you would still build APIs, even if it's not going to be putting a price tag directly on it. It's a really fantastic way to bring the whole platform business model forward. Thanks so much. So Matthias, the details were there on the screen. Matthias, I'm sure will be around in the chats to be able to discuss with you if you want to reach out to him. Thanks so much. I'll invite you to leave the stage now as we welcome